the Father went through a kenosis the same as Jesus Christ, his Son, did. And Jesus taught that at John 5:19 and 20. I only do what I've seen my Father do. Joseph Smith taught that same doctrine. That's clear from his remarks. He says, it's a principle of the gospel to know for a certainty the character of God, to know that we may converse with him as one man converses with another, and that he was once a man like us, yea, that God himself, the Father of us all, dwelt on an earth the same as Jesus Christ did. And he shows it from the Bible, as I have been doing on these videos. Joseph taught that God the Father had been incarnate on an earth as Jesus Christ was. John 5:19 states, the Son can do nothing of himself but what he sees the Father do. For what things soever he doeth, these also doeth the Son likewise. It follows from this passage that if Christ experienced a kenosis, then the Father must have done likewise, because that's what Jesus taught. I'm doing what I saw my Father do. The Greek word for see, vision, seeing, physically, optically seeing, is blepo. That's significant. This is not a mystical situation. Jesus physically watched his Father go through what was a mortal life, and Jesus himself followed after his Father. If Christ were God incarnate on this earth, his Father must likewise have been God incarnate on a similar world. If Christ stepped down from his position of God, as Philippians chapter 2 teaches, then his Father must have done the same. There was a time when the Father ceased to function in the office of God in order to take upon himself humanity and experience mortality. And Christ withdrew from that position for the exact same purpose. That's a biblical doctrine, folks, just like I've been sharing with you. Joseph Smith did not teach, now this is important to understand too, what the prophet did not teach is that there was ever a time when either the Father or the Son ceased to be themselves. That is, they never changed their personalities, nor did they ever alter their fundamental steadfast character. That is the immutability part of God. Joseph never taught that, and neither do the Scriptures. They are immutable in righteousness. They are the same yesterday, today, and forever. Joseph taught that the Father was only what the Bible teaches about Christ. But he took it from Christ as his main example and applied it to Jesus' Father, because that's precisely what Jesus himself has done in the New Testament Gospel of John chapter 5. He voluntarily underwent a kenosis as described in Philippians 2, 6 and 7. Since the kenosis involved God setting aside the functions of his office of God as a member of the Godhead, but not setting aside his divine nature. He remained divine. He just simply stepped out of his office. Joseph Smith was correct to say that God the Father ceased to be God. That is purely a biblical doctrine. And Joseph Smith got it right in the King Follette Discourse. As it regards biblical immutability, Joseph Smith never said that God the Father ceased to have the character of deity, or that he lost his divine nature during his mortal incarnation, any more than Christ did. Joseph never taught that. He simply explained that God ceased to function in his heavenly calling as God in order to become human, and that his humanity was as real as Christ's humanity when he was here on earth. That's what Joseph Smith taught. And here is another very important principle that the Christian philosophers have failed to understand, that is critical in understanding Joseph Smith's ideas about God the Father and Jesus Christ as God. And it is strictly biblical. Dr. Beckwith states this about our teachings. Mormonism teaches that God the Father is a resurrected, exalted human being named Elohim, who was at one time not God. Rather, he was once a mortal man on another planet, who through obedience to the precepts of his God eventually attained exaltation or Godhead himself through eternal progression. That's what Beckwith teaches. Now, in his attempts to explain Mormon theology, Dr. Beckwith has added some speculation in his oversimplification of what Joseph Smith really taught. So this is important to understand the difference. Yes, Mormonism teaches that God the Father is a resurrected, exalted human being, and that he was once a mortal man on a real earth-like planet. But that is exactly what the Bible teaches about Jesus Christ. In Hebrews 1 verse 3 and similar passages, why should it cause consternation among the classical theists when truths about Christ are applied to the Father? It's because they've adapted Greek, Neoplatonic philosophy and metaphysics. It is the Greek philosophy and those meanings that they say teach the truth about God. They put philosophy on a higher level than what the Scripture teaches. Rather, he says, rather than look to Christ as the true source of information about his Father, they assume that the Father is different from Christ. The Father is a metaphysical God described by the apologists, such as Aristotle's unmoved mover. But that is not the biblical definition of God, nor is it the biblical description of God, following Christ's own words. Professor Erickson writes this. He says, Jesus said, "He who has seen me has seen the Father." That's John 14:9. If we know what the love of God, the holiness of God, the power of God are like, we need only to look to Jesus. That's what Erickson says. Well, why stop with such attributes such as love, holiness, and power? The Scriptures teach that he is more than that. The Scriptures teach that Christ is the express image of the Father's very person. Hebrews 1 and 3. He is not the Father, for one is not spoken of as the express image of himself. But he is the complete revelation of the Father, both as to his attributes, his characteristics, his personality, his immutability, his steadfast character, and his physical body and mortal life and death and resurrection. Christ is the full revelation of the Father. That is what the Bible teaches. If then Christ progressed to the point that he was exalted to a position in the Godhead, as we've shown, is it impossible to imagine that the Father at some point in time did the same thing? Of course not. Jesus says that's exactly what happened. John 5:19 and 20. If Christ, and possibly his Father, so progressed, but they are still considered immutable in the Scriptures, and they are, make no mistake about it, they really are, it is clear that eternal progression is not incompatible with immutability. Do you see how that works? We know the Father and the Son have progressed, but we also know they are immutable. So they have changed, but they have not changed. But it doesn't affect their immutability that they became mortal and then went back into the Godhead. That doesn't change any of the immutability, because it's not about the person changing. It's about the office of God that is unchanging. It is about the steadfast divine nature and character and personality and will of the Father and the Son that is unchanging. Isn't that fascinating how that works? Joseph Smith's King Follette Discourse does not contradict that God does not change. Not in the respects with which the Bible teaches. And Joseph Smith strictly taught the biblical doctrine. Immutability relates to God's character, to his constancy in his word, his justice, and to his righteousness. That is how God is unchanging.